I've got some new GW terrain, well it's actually old world old GW terrain from the classic fantasy era of high detailed plastic terrain that you can just basically chuck down on any table. But I've often found that these sorts of things don't really work in games because people just kind of ignore them. People kind of knock them about and they move, so they end up just becoming a bit forgotten and ignored in my experience. So I want to get these old world pieces of terrain and put them to some new uses by combining them with some cheap material and a few extra details to make some really cool scatter terrain. Let's crack on. I won't go into much detail on painting because frankly other videos elsewhere do it better. But in brief, I spray them black and then Hyrax brown on the sprue, which, you know, you can either take or leave it as an option. You can clip them off first if you want. And then for the walls, I paint some of the bricks in different shades like desert yellows or clay-like browns and dark greys before then hitting them with a few different washes of greens and browns and blacks and all that sort of stuff. Then eventually I highlight everything up with just a few highlights of dark greys through to the light greys. The fences are essentially the same, but just dry brushing with browns and light browns instead. Then I pick out some cool details like the vines, gravestones, hanging mace, and even the sneaky gobbo there, and then they're kind of done. So these guys are fine as they are, with a little bit of static grass on the trim around the fences and around the walls. They'd be sorted. You could throw them down on the table. Absolutely perfect bits of terrain. Well, not perfect, because otherwise I wouldn't be doing what I'm going to do next. I just want a little more something to them. Before I started cutting and gluing anything, I decided I needed to actually work out what I was doing here and what I wanted it to look like in the end. So, recreating my youth, I spent a bit of time laid on the carpet rearranging the plastic fences and walls in an order that I thought might make some kind of sense for a usable piece of terrain, and I settled on the idea of a little bit of a farmer's field where it's got a little bit of an allotment on one side with a bit of grass for some animals to roam on the other. So I measured it all out, making sure that I knew exactly how big this thing should be, and then I got to work in the garage. This is nothing fancy, just cheap MDF or plywood from your local DIY shop will do, and make sure the edges are filed down. With the base done, I got working on the makeshift gate that I'm making using some bits of old world terrain from like the tower and some other little bits and pieces I've got. Hopefully it'll have that little something that I'm after. These old GW kits are actually really good for spare parts and bits and bobs that you may not need for the actual building, so I've kept a few things aside just in case, and lucky enough, they've come in use already. The brickwork from the chimney worked nicely to fit into the side of the wall for the gate post, and then there's this wooden dangly hook thing that I used to actually construct the sort of wooden element of the gate that it's hinged onto, and this little wooden flap from a hatch on the old world tower provides a perfect little gate. Using a bit of super glue and activator, it's stuck in place nicely. So I'm going to just paint that gate and the fence post in exactly the same way as the rest of this stuff later on. But next I want to add a bit of contour, a bit of texture to this little piece. So let's crack on with that. To do that, all I did was get some all-purpose filler that's usually used for filling cracks in the walls and all that sort of stuff, and mix it with a bit of PVA to help it bond, and I've just started building up these little furrows on one side of the piece. And I'm going to leave a little path through the centre, so I've got like a little walkway that divides up this allotment area to the little green patch of grass on the other side. So I'm going to just build all that up, and then I put a little blob of hill just to add a little bit of height and difference on the other side of the piece too. I decided to change the layout here, so rather than one of the plastic fence posts, I use a rock for the other side of the gate. I often find that the terrain stuff that you get in the shops are ridiculously expensive. Yes, Geek Gaming Scenics, I'm looking at you. I went out into the garden and just scooped some dust and dirt into a jar. I've got a jar of dirt, I've got a jar of dirt. But on closer inspection, I found that the soil from the garden was a little bit too bright for my needs. I wanted something that looked like it had been freshly ploughed without having to paint anything or fanny around with different colours. This just looked a bit too dry. Luckily, the next day, while I was drinking a cup of coffee and filming it for some reason, I came across an idea. So we just mixed the dirt and the coffee grounds together and made sure it was nice and clean before whacking a load of PVA glue over the filler and cracking on and trying to fill those gaps. Stupidly, I did forget to paint the filler before I did this step, which made it a little bit tricky, so you get some little blobs of white showing through occasionally, but we'll fix that up later, it's fine. I did have to do a couple of layers of this gluing process, and you can see the glue taking on a bit of the coffee colour, but the brown is much more like the furrowed fields that I was hoping for, so I was really happy with this result in the end. But one thing you do have to remember with this sort of thing, especially if you've taken dirt from the garden and coffee, anything organic, you really need to douse the whole thing in some kind of chemical, basically. I used isopropyl alcohol, which has the added benefit of reducing the surface tension of PVA glue, which helps bond everything together much nicer and stops it growing random things. To bond the plastic walls and fences to the wooden board, I used a mixture of glues actually. I used some super glue and some PVA glue. So the super glue in little blobs along to just kind of hold it in place while the PVA glue does the lion's share of the work. I found this works really well in the past, so excuse the pun, but I stuck with it. It may not look it, but we're actually getting pretty close to the end now. There are a lot of final details to just kind of spruce things up, but it's really coming along nicely, and you can see once it's dried that the mud and the coffee mix actually works really well, and of course it's a hell of a lot quicker than putting something down and then trying to paint over it in the end, because that stuff takes ages and ain't nobody got time for that. So onto those details, and it's the gate post that I tackled first, basically painting up in exactly the same way as I mentioned earlier, with these layers of greys with little bricks picked out in different colours and washes and all that sort of stuff. So that's fairly straightforward, similar with the wood, and of course making sure you detail those little metallic hinges and all that sort of stuff. If you're going to do something like this, you might as well add the little bit of detail, because I find that that's the sort of stuff that elevates a terrain piece from being just a bit of thing on the table to actually being something that you're really quite proud of. Right now it's looking pretty drab and uninspiring, but I tell you what, it's going to look sweet as soon as we get some nice flock and other basing materials on. Eagle-eyed viewers of you may notice that the bottle that I'm using is the one from Geek Gaming Scenics, which is some sort of fast-drying PVA glue or something like that. Don't use that, it's crap. I got rid of it in the end. It's too tacky and it doesn't stick properly. It sort of stays this sticky texture for too long. This is good old-fashioned wood glue and PVA glue, and I'm using it to use static grass, and this is an army painted green generic static grass. I wanted this lovely vibrant colour to just give this kind of idyllic kind of setting for my piece of terrain, and I'm using it via a cheap static grass applicator I got off Amazon, and this worked beautifully to make the static grass stand on its end as long as you've got your terrain sort of sat on a bit of baking tray. Next, to do the path running through the centre of these two sections of the bit of terrain, more PVA glue and some basic sand. This is just builder's merchant sand that I've sifted into different kind of textures, so some of it's really fine and some of it's a bit more coarse, and I go with some of the coarse stuff first to sort of line up a little path of rocks down the side of the path, and then while doing this I actually break the little raven or crow or whatever it is off the top of the sign, and then I carry on by filling up the edges of the path with those little sort of tiny pebbles, and then filling in the gaps there with a much finer sand. And I'm not even going to bother painting this because it just looks like a sandy, stony path. To bring the furrows of the ploughed field really to life, you need to have some kind of vegetables or some kind of plant growing in there, and you could go really detailed and go to town on this by finding some sort of 3D prints of cabbages or potato plants or whatever, but I've just gone with a few tufts of army painter, I think it is, green tufts, and I'm just gluing I think 4 or 5 of them into each of these lengths, just so that we can see that there's something growing out of the top of the furrows. And make sure, if you're going to do this sort of thing, that you have the plants going out of the top of the thing, not in the crevices between them, because that's just how farming works. Trust me on this. I'm from Lincolnshire. Now, you could call that finished, but please spare me this one indulgence, because I saw on Warlord Games that they're selling these farmyard miniatures, 28mm scale miniatures, and there's like chickens, there's dogs, there's cats, there's donkeys and cows and some sheep. So I got a couple of little cheeky sheep and threw them on the grassy area just to add a little bit of detail, but obviously you don't need to do this sort of thing. I did say this was meant to be a cheap way of making GW terrain work, but I thought this extra little detail just adds that extra something that I was gunning for the whole time. So without much further ado, here's the finished product and a few other fields that I made along the way. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this terrain tutorial. It's been a little bit different. Obviously, I've been painting miniatures a lot on this channel and playing games and painting miniatures at a castle and with a baby in tow and all that sort of stuff recently. But it's been a really nice palette cleanser doing some terrain for my upcoming tournament, Tis a Gathering, which I'm really excited for. It's just something about terrain just makes me feel a bit more motivated to get back onto painting miniatures again. So I've really enjoyed it. I also want to say thank you also to my patron supporters. Many of you have been doing it for many years. I'm really appreciative of it. Particularly there's a few of you who've been doing it for nearly 5 years now. There's Nathan Talbot, Andrew Cuthbert, Michael Haskell, Russell Preece, and there are more who've been doing it for many years, and I'll give you shout outs in upcoming videos. But thank you so much for your ongoing support, for just being able to keep the podcast and everything else ticking along here at Entmoot HQ. So thank you so much for that. If you want to become a patron supporter, just follow the links in the description down below, or drop me a like and a subscribe at the very least. Thanks very much for watching. Until next time, boo-a-rum.